Article 1179 states that obligation dependent on a future uncertain event or an unknown past event are considered valid and binding based on the occurrence of that event. Every obligation which contains a resolutory condition shall also be demandable without prejudice to the effects to the happening of the event. For example, you promise to give your friend 500 pesos if it rains tomorrow. Your obligation is to give the money depends on whether it rains. If it rains, then you have to pay 500 pesos. If it doesn't, then you don't have to pay. A pure obligation is an obligation that is not subject to any condition and is immediately demandable. It does not depend on any future or uncertain event. It must be fulfilled as soon as it is created. For example, you buy a book from a store. As soon as you make the purchase, you owe the store the price of the book. There are no conditions or future events needed. You must pay for the book immediately. A conditional obligation is an obligation that depends on a future uncertain event or an unknown past event. The fulfillment of the obligation is contingent upon occurrence or non-occurrence of that event. If the event happens, the obligation becomes effective. If it does not happen, the obligation does not take effect. For example, you agree to help your classmate with their assignment if they provide you with the lecture slide. Your obligation to help them is conditional upon them giving you the lecture slides. If they provide the slides, then you help them. If they do not, then you're not obligated to help them.
Characteristics of a condition. Future and uncertain. In order to constitute an event a condition, it is not enough that it is to be future. It must also be uncertain. The first paragraph of Article 1179 obviously uses the adjective or between future and uncertain to distinguish pure obligation from both conditional obligation and one with a period. Be that it may, the word should be means sa future kailangan dapat certain talaga. Sigurado. Bawal yung mga unexpected na alimaris like that. Next is past but unknown. A condition may refer to the past event unknown to the party. It refers to a future event both its very appearance and time of such appearance must be uncertain, otherwise it is not condition. It means kailangan that may pinag-agreehan to ng two parties na condition na alam ng both parties para sa future. Next is condition is must not be impossible.
Two principal kinds of condition. First is the suspensive condition. Is a condition the happening of which will give rise to the obligation. The demandability of the obligation is suspended until the happening of the condition. For example, I will give you a laptop if you pass the board exam. In this scenario, the condition of passing the board exam suspends the obligation to give the laptop until the condition is fulfilled. Once the creditor passed the board exam, the suspensive condition is met and the obligation to give the laptop comes into effect. Second is the resolutory condition. Is a condition the happening of which extinguishes the obligation. The obligation is demandable at once, but it shall be extinguished upon the happening of the condition. For example, I will let you use my car until you get a job. This example is considered a resolutory condition. In this case, the resolutory condition is the individual getting a job. Once the condition of getting a job is met, the agreement or permission to use the car may come to an end.
Article 1180. When the debtor binds himself to pay when he means permits to do so, the obligation shall be deemed to be one with the period, subject to the provision of Article 1197. For the duration of period depends upon the will of the debtor. A period is a future uncertain event upon the arrival of which the obligation subject to it either arises or extinguishes. The debtor promises to pay when it means permit to do so. It means si debtor committed siya sa obligation na pinasok niya. Sa condition nila ni debtor and creditor means may specific date na kailangan magbayad ni creditor ay ni debtor kasi committed siya dun eh. ayun yung pinasok niya. May kasunduan sila ni creditor. And that is a commitment kasi usapan niya yung kasunduan. It is meron silang specific date is when kung kailan magbabayad si debtor.
Article 1181 of the Civil Code deals with conditional obligations in contracts. It states that in conditional obligations, the acquisition or loss of rights depend on the occurrence of the event that constitutes the condition. In simpler terms, this article highlights that the right and obligations of the parties in a contract are dependent upon fulfilling the specified condition. The effectiveness of this right is tied to the happening of the event that serves as the condition in the contract. Example scenario: LJ agrees to sell her vintage record player to Robbie for 10,000 pesos. However, LJ specifies that the sale will only be valid if Robbie's friend Carl confirms that the record player is in good working condition. Carl inspects the record player and confirms that it is in good working order. As a result, the sale between LJ and Robbie is finalized, and Robbie pays 10,000 pesos to LJ. In this scenario, Article 1181 of the Civil Code is illustrated. The condition set by LJ, which is the confirmation from Carl regarding the working condition of the record player, is a suspensive condition. The sale between LJ and Robbie is contingent upon this condition being fulfilled. Once Carl confirms the working condition of the record player, the suspensive condition is met and the sale becomes effective.
Article 1182 of the new Civil Code states, when the fulfillment of the condition depends upon the sole will, the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void. A casual condition is an uncertain event that determines whether someone has to do what they promise. For example, ipapamana ko sa iyo yung buong business ng pamilya natin basta papakasalan mo yung taong to. Article 1182 is a mixed condition, one which depends upon the will of one of the contracting parties and other circumstances, including the will of a third person.
A potestative condition is a condition in a contract that depends solely on the will or choice of one of the parties involved. In simpler terms, it's a condition where someone has control over whether it is fulfilled. For example, I'll pay you 100 pesos if I feel like it is a potestative condition because whether the payment is made depends entirely on the person's feeling rather than any external factors. A suspensive condition that depends upon the will of the debtor means that the fulfillment of the condition is within the control of the person who owes something in a contract. In simpler terms, the condition must be fulfilled by the person who has to do something. For example, I'll pay you 500 pesos if I get my paycheck next week is a suspensive condition where the debtor receipts of their paycheck determines whether they pay. A suspensive condition that depends upon the will of the creditor means that the fulfillment of the condition is within the control of the person to whom something owed in a contract. In simpler terms, the condition must be fulfilled by the person who is owed something. I'll pay you 100 pesos if you accept my apology is an example of a suspensive condition where the debtor's apology being accepted depends entirely on the will of the creditor. If the creditor accepts the apology, the payment is triggered. If the payment is not, then it's not required. Casual and mixed condition. Casual condition, a condition in a contract that depends on an event or circumstances outside the control of either party. It relies on chances or external factors beyond the party's influence. Mixed condition, a condition in a contract that combines elements of both suspensive and casual condition. It includes aspects that depend on the will of the parties involved as well as the external factors that controls it.
Article 1183, Impossible Conditions. Those contrary to good customs or public policy and those prohibited by law shall annul the obligation which depends upon them. If the obligation is divisible, that part thereof which is not affected by the impossible or unlawful condition shall be valid. The article refers to suspensive conditions, which means that the obligation depends on a certain event happening before it becomes enforceable. When a condition is considered impossible or unlawful or against the law, it annuls the entire obligation. We have two kinds of impossible condition. One, physically impossible conditions. It means when their nature of things cannot exist or cannot be done. Refers to a condition that is impossible to fulfill due to physical or natural constraint. It is a condition that cannot be met or no matter how hard you try. For example, I will sell you my land if you do not carry 20 kilograms of rice on your shoulder. It implies the speaker is attempting to convey a condition to someone. The claims that if they do not carry 20 kilograms of rice, the land will sell them to the person referred to. And it is literally impossible to perform. No one can carry 20 kilograms of rice for a single person. Number 2, legally impossible conditions. It means when they are contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. Refers to a condition that is impossible to fulfill because it violates a law. For example, I will give you 10,000 if you sell my land and give me your car, and if you kill Pedro. This example involves a condition that requires the performance of an illegal act, which is forbidden by law. It requires the person to sell their land and give their car, and also to commit a serious crime by killing another person, which is Pedro. Both of their acts are prohibited by law and cannot be performed, making the condition legally impossible to fulfill. So now, what are the effects of impossible conditions? First, conditional obligation is void. It means impossible conditions annul the obligation which depends upon them. It implies that it's either physically or legally the condition and obligation ay parehas na mawawalan ng saysay. Kasi alam ng obligee na yung obligation ay hindi niya kayang gawin or imposibleng mangyari. At wala rin siyang intention para gawin yun. For example, Jonathan will give Yael 15,000 if Yael will kill Bob. And that's legally impossible. Because killing is a crime and it against the law. And the subject is also void because it's subject to an impossible condition. Conditional obligation is valid. It means if the condition is negative, that is, not to do an impossible thing, if it is disregarded and the obligation is rendered pure and valid. It implies that the condition is not to do an impossible thing. For example, Jonathan will give 15,000 to Yael if Yael will not kill Bob. So in this case, this means Jonathan's obligation remained valid, and he also obligated to give Yael a 15K. However, if Yael does kill Bob, the condition is not satisfied, and Jonathan's obligation to give Yael the 15,000 is considered invalid. So, negative, both conditional obligation is valid. Only the affected obligation void. It means if the obligation is divisible, the part thereof not affected by the impossible condition shall be valid. For example, I will give you 10,000 if you sell my land and give me your car, and if you kill Pedro. In that case, to give 10,000 is valid, but the obligation to give the car is void because it is depend upon impossible conditions, which is to kill Pedro. Next is only the condition void. It means if the obligation is a pre-existing obligation and therefore does not depend upon the fulfillment of the condition, which is impossible for its existence, only the condition is void. So, pre-existing obligation, it means like bago ka palang patawan ng obligation, meron nang nauna na valid and existing obligations. So, yung condition dito is parang bigla na lang nagkaroon, wala kayong pinag-usapan. For example, there is a contract between a debtor and a creditor, and a debtor owes the creditor 15,000. If the creditor later agrees to kill someone before the debtor pays him, then only the condition of killing someone is void. The main obligation of the debtor to pay the creditor, 15,000, remains valid.
The condition that some event happen at a determinate time shall extinguish the obligation as soon as the time expires or if the event will not take place. For example, A promised to give B a parcel of land if B will marry his daughter C this year. If C died or married someone else, or B has not still married C within the said year, the obligation of A to give is extinguished. When no period is stipulated, the rule in second paragraph of Article 1185 is applicable. A promised to give B a parcel of land if B will marry his daughter C. If C died or married someone else, the obligation of A to give is extinguished. The condition that some event will not happen at a determinate time shall render the obligation effective from the moment the time indicated has elapsed, or if it has become evident that the event cannot occur. For example, I would give you our house, but you should take care for me in 7 years. After 7 years and you still takes care of me, ibibigay ko na yung bahay na pinangako ko. Pero kapag 3 years mo lang akong inalagaan, di ko na ibibigay sa'yo yung bahay kasi yung napagkasunduan natin ay 7 years.